Joann is a national chain of stores known for selling fabrics and crafts that has been around for over 80 years now. Over that time, it has grown to over 800 locations found in every US state except Hawaii, but as of right now, it is looking like many of those stores may be shutting down. Throughout its extensive history, Joann has somehow survived through some concerning times, though none of them quite as concerning as the past few years. Just a few of the highlights. In May of 2023, the CEO of the company left after what he referred to as a challenging year. And here we are over a year and a half later, and they have yet to name a permanent replacement. Though it is more likely that you have heard the bigger news that happened in March of 2024 when Joann filed for bankruptcy, reporting over $1 billion in debt. Well, from there, the creditors took control of the company, taking it off the stock market, and in the process, the debt was just about cut in half. There were minimal layoffs, none of the stores closed, so on the surface, it seemed like nothing more than a minor setback with a quick recovery. However, not even a year later, in January of 2025, they filed for bankruptcy again. This time, they have already announced the closure of a handful of stores, and there is a strong possibility that all of them will be liquidated if they are unable to find a buyer that is willing to keep them open. Throughout all this time, I've been reading comments from people requesting that I make this video explaining what happened to Joann, and I can understand why people are curious about this. Yet another iconic US retailer has been struggling, so for today, I'm going to talk about the history of this company while doing my best to outline 5 of the biggest reasons behind its decline. Starting off with less sewing. Anybody watching this that does any sewing at all can probably back me up when I say that Joann is like the go-to store for all things sewing. They sell over $1 billion of sewing-related merchandise each year, controlling about 1/3 of the market, making them the biggest in the country. The company was started in Ohio in the 1940s by multiple German immigrants who came together to open that first store, none of which were named Joann. In fact, I think it's funny that there has never been anybody significant to the company with that name. Oddly enough, it is a combination of 2 of the founders' daughters, named Joan and Jacqueline Ann. The store was originally called Cleveland Fabric Shop, but that is a very local name, so as they expanded into new areas of the country, they started using Joann as the name of the stores, but the overall company was called Fabry Centers of America. By the 1970s, they had grown to about 170 stores. Almost all of them were smaller than we would picture a Joann store to be today, and located within shopping malls. That right there is when sewing really started to lose popularity. The biggest single reason behind it was more women entering the workforce. The 1970s is where that cultural shift started happening in a big way, so they were not at home as much and had less time to dedicate towards sewing. So in response, the department stores and the discount stores shrunk or even eliminated their sewing sections in favor of selling a wider variety of clothing. Now, here is the tricky part. By the 1980s, there were still many different fabric retail chains, so it basically became survival of the fittest and turned into one of the most competitive industries out there, leading me right into the next reason on my list, competition, which is not going to be as straightforward as you might expect. This is going to be counterintuitive, but with lower demand for fabrics, the fabric stores did not shrink, but instead they all started growing in hopes of attracting a bigger share of the market and being that last one standing. So many of them, including Joann, started following the category killer trend of the 1980s. They started opening much bigger stores that were typically now freestanding or in strip malls. They started advertising more heavily, opened giant distribution centers to support a wider variety of merchandise. In short, by the 1990s, the market was oversaturated and there were way too many fabric stores. Most of them were now in debt from all the expansion and struggling to attract enough customers to make money, and logically, the industry started consolidating. Many of the chains were either shut down or acquired by one of the competing chains. Notably, in 1994, Joann acquired Cloth World for $62 million. It was a chain of 343 fabric stores, mostly found in the South, where they had yet to establish much of a presence, so it was like a perfect way for them to enter the new area. In 1998, they bought House of Fabrics for about $100 million. It was one of their biggest competitors. It pushed their store count above 1,000 and sort of declared Joann as the fabric store that came out on top. Shortly after, they changed the name of all these various stores that they controlled to Joann, giving them a more consistent brand, and that is how they came to be a national chain. One of the biggest takeaways from this is that in the process of filling these bigger stores and expanding their selection, they started offering a lot of supplies for various arts and crafts. Their CEO at the time said, "Our expanded product mix reflects the industry trend toward increased consumer interest in crafts and home decor." So even though they practically took over the fabric and sewing market, they had ventured into a new market that now competes much more directly with other national chains like Michaels and Hobby Lobby, not to mention all of the online retailers that almost go without saying at this point as being a threat to most physical stores. More recently, there have been complaints about Joann being less organized and the employees being less helpful compared to the others, potentially due to some layoffs, but as I go through the rest of my list, I think you will see how Joann is simply not in a great position to be competing against them. Next up on my list of reasons behind their decline is a buyout. Something that I think you'll agree comes up on these lists far too often, but it really does complicate things. See, following all that craziness in the 1990s, Joann was weak. They were like a boxer walking out of the ring all beat up after winning a tough match. I mean, building all those giant stores and buying up their competitors was expensive and put them pretty far into debt. But you'll be happy to hear that over the next decade, they were slowly able to recover. Sales grew to over $2 billion per year as their debt was reduced to practically nothing. But here comes the trouble. In 2010, Joann was sold to a private equity firm called Leonard Green for $1.6 billion. It was a 34% premium over their trading price and appears to have been mostly leveraged, meaning debt was added to the company to make it happen. I will admit that it is kind of aggravating to follow this story, to see the company stabilize after such a sketchy situation just to be placed right back into more sketchiness. I feel the same way every time I hear that David Blaine is doing a new stunt. No disrespect to him, but at a certain point, you just have to calm down and be thankful that you made it through as much as you have. My point here is pretty straightforward. Without this buyout adding so much debt to the company, they would not be in so much debt and would not be filing for bankruptcy to relieve that debt. I mean, this has to be the most direct reason behind all of their recent struggles. But moving on to the next reason on my list that I'm going to call external factors. Here I'm talking about things recently beyond the company's control that have made it difficult to operate under such a weakened financial condition. One of these things ties into the overall economy. Interest rates and inflation have hurt sales by making customers less likely to buy these kind of items, or more likely to go to a cheaper competitor when they do buy these items. But probably the more impactful external factor has been the pandemic. While that was happening, people were making their own masks and staying at home where they would sew or do different arts and crafts. All of the figures at Joann started going up during that time, like their sales and their income. In fact, the owners seemingly took advantage of that ray of hope by putting a portion of the company back on the stock market, raising over $100 million by doing it. But as the restrictions were lifted and people were not spending as much time at home doing crafts, all of those numbers fell right back down. Yeah, oddly enough, the pandemic ending is one of the worst things that could have happened to them. $100 invested in Joann at that initial public offering would have been down to about $30 in less than 2 years, and practically down to nothing by the time of that first bankruptcy. Another graph that I think is interesting to look at in this case is the one for net income. I want to point out that a lot of those losses are due to goodwill impairments, essentially the company recognizing that it has lost value, but still, everything factored in, it shows how bad things were before and after the pandemic. Their long-term debt was even reduced briefly before climbing right back up and forcing them into these bankruptcies. Moving on to the final reason on my list, which is issues with inventory. On the topic of the second bankruptcy, it's never good when you have to clarify that, Joann's interim CEO said the last several years have presented significant and lasting challenges in the retail environment, which coupled with our current financial position and constrained inventory levels forced us to take this step. The actual filing addresses the inventory by stating that there was an unexpected ramp down and in some cases the entire cessation of production. Alright, I wanted to include that partially because I've never used the word cessation before.
Cessation.
But also because it highlights how much trouble they have been having securing inventory, which is clearly not good for a retailer retailer that relies on a wide selection of products and can be counted as another potential reason customers have been favoring the competition. They say that they source 44% of their products from other countries, particularly China, where tariffs on imports have been pricey. So they've been working to diversify their suppliers to be from other countries where freight costs, well, have still been expensive. And just the very fact that Joann has been in such a bad financial position means that the suppliers have been wanting the money in advance because they do not trust that they will be able to pay it, and as you may have guessed, Joann does not have that much cash on hand to make these deals happen. So it all turns into a spiral where existing problems are creating new problems, and it has come to a point where something major has to happen for them to have a chance of pulling out of it. Honestly, looking at the big picture at this point, they have made so many risky moves, have become seemingly so inefficient, and have lost a lot of their customers to a point where I have to question how much demand there is for them to remain open. I want to ask if you see them as more of a falling apart version of Hobby Lobby, or is there something special about them that you would hate to see go away? They say that their vision is to be the inspirational leader that helps everyone find their happy place through superior assortments, presentation, and service, which sounds great to me, but I have to question if they are living up to it. Let me know in the comments, what do you see for the future of Joann? Will they remain a prime spot to buy sewing and crafting materials, or are we witnessing the company unravel into its ultimate end? Also, for anyone who shops at Joann regularly, I would really be interested to hear, what do you buy there specifically, and why do you choose to go there over somewhere else? Is it the selection, or convenience, or maybe just a habit at this point since they've been around for so long? Tell me what it is, and any other thoughts you have about Joann. I know it sounds like I'm talking about a person every time I say that. Leave them in the comments. I'd like to hear what you have to say. Thank you for watching.